The bullet had torn through Jake Morrison's shoulder 3 days ago, and the pain still burned like hellfire with every breath he took. Blood had long since soaked through the makeshift bandage he'd wrapped around the wound, leaving dark stains on his torn shirt. He pressed his back against the rough wooden wall of the abandoned barn on the outskirts of Redemption Creek, listening for the sound of approaching hoofbeats. The bounty hunters had been tracking him for weeks, and he knew they wouldn't stop until they collected the $500 on his head. His Colt .45 felt heavy in his trembling hand, but he'd be damned if he'd go down without a fight. The sound of soft footsteps in the dust made him cock the hammer of his revolver, finger tight on the trigger. Through the gap in the barn door, he saw a slight figure approaching, not the heavy boots of a bounty hunter, but the delicate step of someone trying not to make noise. A young woman emerged from the shadows, her dark hair braided down her back, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days. Her olive skin and the way she moved with cautious grace told him she wasn't from around these parts. When their eyes met through the crack in the door, he saw fear there, but also something else, a desperate kind of hope. She spoke in accented English, her voice barely above a whisper as she glanced nervously over her shoulder. "Por favor, señor, I need help," she said, her hands clasped together in front of her chest. The Spanish words mixed with her broken English told him she was likely Mexican, maybe running from something or someone herself. Jake had seen enough desperate people in his 32 years to recognize the look in her eyes. This girl, she couldn't be more than 19 or 20, was in the kind of trouble that followed a person like a shadow. "Stay back," Jake growled, though his voice lacked its usual menace due to the pain coursing through his body. The girl, Maria, she'd said her name was Maria Esperanza, didn't retreat as he expected. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the blood seeping through his shirt. "You are hurt," she said simply, as if stating the obvious somehow made it less dangerous for her to be there. Her gaze darted to his gun, then back to his face, and he saw no judgment there, only concern. In a world where most folks would cross the street to avoid him, her compassion struck him like a physical blow. The distant sound of horses approaching made them both freeze, and Jake could see the terror that flashed across Maria's features. She grabbed his good arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging into his skin. "They come for me too," she whispered urgently, her accent thickening with fear. "The sheriff, he say I steal, but I no steal nothing. I work honest in the cantina, but Senor Henderson, he—" Her voice trailed off, but Jake understood. He'd seen Henderson around town, a wealthy rancher with wandering hands and a reputation for taking what he wanted, regardless of consent. Jake made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. "Get behind those hay bales," he ordered, jerking his head toward the back of the barn. Maria hesitated for just a moment, then hurried to the hiding spot, her skirts rustling softly in the straw. Jake positioned himself by the door, his wounded shoulder screaming in protest as he raised his gun. The approaching riders were close now. He could hear their voices carrying on the desert wind. "Whatever happens," he called softly to Maria, "don't make a sound." The 3 men who rode up to the barn were exactly what Jake had expected. Rough-looking bounty hunters with hard eyes and harder faces. The leader, a man named Crow he recognized from wanted posters, dismounted and approached the barn with his rifle ready. "We know you're in there, Morrison," Crow called out. "Come out peaceful and we'll make it quick." His companions flanked the barn, cutting off any chance of escape. Jake could feel Maria's eyes on him from her hiding place, and something about her presence gave him strength he hadn't felt in months. "I got nothing to say to you boys," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the pain. Through the gaps in the barn wall, he could see the men positioning themselves for an assault. Crow signaled to his men, and Jake knew they'd be coming through that door any second. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years running from the law, and now he was about to die protecting someone else who was being hunted unjustly. Maybe there was some kind of poetry in that, though he'd never been much for reading. The first man through the door caught Jake's bullet in the chest and went down hard, his rifle clattering across the wooden floor. The second man got off a shot that splintered the wood near Jake's head before Jake's return fire sent him spinning into the wall. Crow was smarter, staying back and firing through the doorway, forcing Jake to duck behind a wooden post. "Give it up, Morrison!" Crow shouted. "You're bleeding out anyway. Why die for nothing?" But Jake wasn't dying for nothing anymore, he realized. For the first time in his life, he was fighting for someone else. When the shooting stopped and the dust settled, Jake found himself still breathing, though barely. Crow lay motionless near the door, and his 2 companions were beyond caring about bounties. Jake's legs gave out, and he slumped against the post, his vision blurring from blood loss. Maria emerged from her hiding place like an angel stepping out of a dream, her face pale but determined. She knelt beside him, tearing strips from her petticoat to bind his wounds properly. "Why?" she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Why you help me?" Jake looked into her eyes and saw something he'd forgotten existed in the world, pure, honest goodness. And in that moment, he knew that whatever happened next, his life had just taken a turn towards something he'd never dared hope for: redemption. Maria's hands worked with surprising skill as she cleaned Jake's wounds, her touch gentle but firm. She'd learned to tend injuries working in her family's small village in Sonora before crossing the border 2 years ago, searching for the better life her dying father had dreamed of for her. "My papa, he was hurt in the mines," she explained softly as she worked, her accent lending a musical quality to her words. "I learn to help, to heal what I can." Jake studied her face in the dim light filtering through the barn's weathered walls, noting the determination in her dark eyes, the way her jaw set when she concentrated. This wasn't just some frightened girl. This was a woman who'd survived things that would break most people. "You don't owe me nothing," Jake said, wincing as she tightened the bandage around his shoulder. His voice was rougher than he intended, a lifetime of keeping people at arm's length, making tenderness feel foreign on his tongue. Maria paused in her work, her eyes meeting his with startling directness. "In my village we have saying," she replied, "El que salva una vida salva el mundo entero." He who saves one life saves the whole world. Her fingers brushed against his skin as she secured the binding, and Jake felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with his wounds. When was the last time someone had touched him with kindness instead of violence? The story Maria told him as they waited for full darkness painted a picture of injustice that made Jake's own troubles seem simple by comparison. She'd been working at the Silver Dollar Cantina, sending most of her wages back to her mother and younger siblings in Mexico. "Senor Henderson, he come every week," she said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "He drink too much. He try to touch. When I say no, he get angry." The night everything changed, Henderson had cornered her in the storage room, his hands and intentions clear. When she'd fought back, knocking over a crate of expensive whiskey in her escape, he'd claimed she was stealing from him. "Sheriff Hawkins, he is Henderson's friend. He no listen when I try to explain." Jake found himself growing angrier with each word of Maria's story, a fury that burned hotter than the pain in his shoulder. He'd known men like Henderson his whole life, men who used their power and position to take what they wanted from people who couldn't fight back. "How long you been running?" he asked, noting the worn state of her boots, the way her dress hung loose from missed meals. 3 weeks, she told him, sleeping in abandoned buildings and taking work where she could find it, always looking over her shoulder for Sheriff Hawkins and his deputies. She'd been heading for California, hoping to find work in one of the mission towns where her language wouldn't be such a barrier. As night fell, Jake made a decision that surprised even him. "There's a place up in the mountains," he said, struggling to his feet despite Maria's protests. "Old mining camp called Silver Creek, been abandoned for 5 years, but the cabins are still standing." He'd used it as a hideout before, knew the trails that led there like the back of his hand. It would be safe, at least temporarily, and give him time to figure out what to do next. Maria looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. "But you need doctor," she said, noting the pallor of his skin, the way he swayed on his feet. "This can wait," Jake replied, though they both knew it couldn't. The journey up the mountain trail tested Jake's remaining strength to its limits, but Maria proved to be a capable companion, steadying him when he stumbled and keeping watch for any sign of pursuit. She told him more about her life as they climbed, about the brother who'd been killed in a mining accident, the sister who'd married and moved to Texas, the mother who prayed every night for her daughter's safe return. "I write letters," Maria said, helping Jake navigate a particularly steep section of trail. "But I cannot send them. They think I am dead, maybe." The sadness in her voice made Jake's chest tighten with an unfamiliar emotion. When they finally reached Silver Creek, Jake felt a strange sense of coming home, though he'd never stayed in one place long enough to understand what home really meant. The abandoned mining camp sat in a small valley, surrounded by pine trees, a dozen weathered cabins arranged around what had once been the main shaft. Maria gasped at the beauty of it, the way moonlight painted the wooden structures silver, the sound of a nearby creek that had given the place its name. "Is like a ghost town," she whispered, but there was wonder in her voice rather than fear. Jake chose the most solid-looking cabin for them to shelter in, one with a stone fireplace and walls that would keep out the mountain cold. As Maria built a fire with practiced efficiency, Jake found himself studying her in the flickering light, trying to understand what it was about her that made him want to be a better man. She moved with unconscious grace, her hands quick and sure as she arranged kindling and struck flint to steel. When the flames caught and began to dance, casting warm shadows on the cabin walls, she smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since they'd met. "Is warm," she said simply, holding her hands out to the fire. "Is safe." The word safe hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither of them wanted to examine too closely. That night, as Maria slept on a makeshift bed of blankets near the fire, Jake kept watch despite his exhaustion, his gun ready across his knees. But his thoughts weren't on bounty hunters or sheriffs. They were on the woman who'd chosen to help a wounded outlaw instead of running for her own safety. He'd spent 15 years believing that people were fundamentally selfish, that kindness was just another word for weakness. Maria was challenging everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. The way she'd looked at him, not with fear or disgust, but with something that might have been hope, made him wonder if redemption was actually possible for a man like him. As dawn approached, Jake made a promise to himself that he'd never made before. He would protect Maria Esperanza, not just from the immediate dangers that pursued them, but from a world that seemed determined to punish her for being different, for being vulnerable, for being good. He didn't know how he'd do it, didn't know if he'd live long enough to see it through, but for the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison had found something worth fighting for, besides his own survival. And as the first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin window, illuminating Maria's peaceful face, he felt something he'd thought was dead inside him begin to stir back to life, something that might have been hope. The third morning at Silver Creek brought visitors Jake hadn't expected, and ones he definitely hadn't wanted. The sound of approaching horses woke him from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months, and he cursed himself for getting soft, for letting his guard down even for a moment. Through the cabin window, he could see Sheriff Hawkins and 2 deputies picking their way up the mountain trail, their badges glinting in the morning sun like targets. But it wasn't Jake they were looking for. It was Maria, and the grim determination on Hawkins' face told Jake that the sheriff had no intention of bringing her back alive to face trial. Henderson's money talked loud in Redemption Creek, and dead witnesses couldn't contradict his version of events. Maria saw them too, her face going pale as morning frost as she recognized the star on Hawkins' vest. "They find me," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for Jake's arm. How they know where to look? Jake's mind raced through the possibilities, settling on the most likely and most troubling explanation. Someone had talked, someone who knew about his old hideouts and wasn't afraid to sell that information. Tom Garrett, most likely, a weasel of a man who'd helped Jake fence stolen goods in the past and would sell his own mother for the right price. The betrayal stung, but not as much as the fear in Maria's eyes, the way she looked at him like he was her last hope in a world gone mad. "There's another way out," Jake said, grabbing his gun belt and what supplies they could carry quickly. "Trail that leads down the backside of the mountain." But even as he said it, he knew they were in trouble. His shoulder was still weak, slowing him down, and Maria wasn't dressed for rough country travel. The deputies would be fresh, well-armed, and motivated by Henderson's bounty money. Still, he'd be damned if he'd let them take her without a fight. As they slipped out the back of the cabin, Jake caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. One of the deputies was carrying a rope, already fashioned into a noose. They weren't planning to bring Maria back for trial at all. The chase down the mountain was a nightmare of loose rocks and steep drops, with the sound of pursuing horses growing closer by the minute. Maria proved tougher than she looked, keeping up despite her long skirts and worn boots, never complaining, even when thorns tore at her clothes and branches scratched her face. But Jake could see she was flagging, her breathing coming in sharp gasps as they scrambled down a particularly treacherous slope. Behind them, Sheriff Hawkins' voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Give up the girl, Morrison, and we'll let you ride out of here." The lie was so obvious it would have been insulting if it weren't so dangerous. When Maria stumbled and nearly fell over a cliff edge, Jake made the hardest decision of his life. "Keep going," he told her, pressing his spare gun into her hands. "Follow the creek bed until you reach the old mission road, then head west toward California." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she realized what he was planning. "No," she said fiercely, her accent thick with emotion. "I no leave you to die for me." But Jake was already moving, finding a defensive position among the rocks where he could make his stand. "You got a life to live," he called back to her. Don't waste it on a dead man. The gunfight that followed was brief but brutal, echoing across the mountain like thunder. Jake's position among the rocks gave him good cover, and he made every shot count, but he was outnumbered and outgunned. One deputy went down with a bullet in his leg, screaming and clutching his thigh as blood seeped between his fingers. Sheriff Hawkins took cover behind a boulder, his face twisted with rage and frustration. "You're only making this harder on yourself, Morrison," he shouted. "Henderson wants the girl dead, and he's paying enough to make sure it happens." The admission hung in the air like gun smoke, confirming what Jake had suspected. This was about silencing Maria permanently, not bringing her to justice. What Jake didn't expect was for Maria to circle back, approaching the deputies from behind with the stealth of a mountain cat. She'd grown up in country almost as rough as this, he realized, and she knew how to move quietly through difficult terrain. When she pressed his spare gun to the back of Sheriff Hawkins' neck, her voice was steady as steel. "Drop your weapons," she said in English, clearer than Jake had ever heard from her. "All of you." The remaining deputy looked at his wounded partner, then at his boss with a gun to his head, and slowly placed his rifle on the ground. Maria's eyes never left Hawkins' face as she spoke. "You think because I am Mexican, I am stupid, but I know what you plan." The sheriff's face went through several shades of red as he realized his position. "You can't prove nothing," he blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. Maria smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "I no need prove," she said. "I just need tell truth." She reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small leather journal, its pages filled with careful handwriting. "I write everything down. Every time Henderson come to Cantina. Every time he try to touch me, hurt other girls. Every time you help him hide what he do." Jake felt a surge of admiration for her intelligence, her foresight in documenting the crimes she'd witnessed. This wasn't just some frightened girl running from false accusations. This was a woman who'd been building a case against her tormentors. The revelation changed everything, and Jake could see the moment when Sheriff Hawkins realized his career, and possibly his life, hung in the balance. "That don't mean nothing," he said desperately. "Your word against his... Who's gonna believe a Mexican whore?" The slur made Jake's finger tighten on his trigger, but Maria placed a restraining hand on his arm, her touch surprisingly calm. "Maybe no one believed me," she admitted, "but I also write about the other girls Henderson hurt. Mary Patterson, she worked at General Store. Susan Wheeler, the preacher's daughter. Emma Collins, the bank president's niece." With each name, Hawkins' face grew paler, realizing the scope of what Maria had documented. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with Maria holding all the cards, but Jake knowing that desperate men do desperate things. That's when the unexpected happened. The sound of more horses approaching from the main trail, but these weren't more deputies or bounty hunters. Jake recognized the voice calling out before he saw the man. "Sheriff Hawkins, this is Judge Morrison from the Territorial Court." Jake's heart nearly stopped. Judge Morrison, his uncle, the man who'd raised him after his parents died, the man whose disappointment had driven Jake to a life of crime in the first place. The one person in the world whose opinion still mattered to him was about to see him at gunpoint with a Mexican girl and a wounded deputy, and Jake realized that some kinds of shame cut deeper than any bullet ever could. Judge Samuel Morrison rode into the standoff like a force of nature, his white hair and stern features commanding immediate respect, even in the chaos of the mountainside confrontation. At 65, he still sat his horse like a man half his age, and his sharp eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who'd spent 40 years sorting truth from lies. Jake felt 15 years old again under that penetrating gaze, remembering the disappointment in those same eyes the day he'd been sentenced for his first robbery. "Jacob," the judge said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than any shouted condemnation could have. "I heard you were dead." The pain in his uncle's voice hit Jake harder than any bullet. Maria stepped forward, still holding the gun steady on Sheriff Hawkins, but addressing the judge with surprising composure. "Your Honor," she said, her accent careful but clear. "This man, he tried to kill me to protect his friend who hurt women." She held out her journal with her free hand, never taking her eyes off Hawkins. "I write everything, all the crimes I see, all the girls he hurt." Judge Morrison dismounted slowly, his weathered hands gentle as he took the journal from Maria. As he read, his face grew darker with each page, the lines around his eyes deepening with what looked like genuine sorrow. "Sheriff Hawkins," he said finally, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench, "you're under arrest." The moment stretched like a held breath until Hawkins made his move, grabbing for his hidden derringer with desperate speed. But Jake was faster, his Colt clearing leather and barking once, the bullet taking the corrupt sheriff center mass and spinning him to the ground. The echo of the gunshot faded into mountain silence, broken only by the whimpering of the wounded deputy and the sound of Maria's shaky breathing. Judge Morrison looked at his nephew with an expression Jake couldn't read, disappointment certainly, but also something that might have been understanding. "You saved her life," the judge said simply, "and possibly saved many others." It was the closest thing to approval Jake had heard from him in 15 years. What came next surprised everyone, especially Jake. As they made camp that night, the judge having declared himself content to sort things out properly rather than rush back to town, Maria began to tell her story in full, her journal serving as evidence of a web of corruption that reached deep into Redemption Creek's power structure. Henderson wasn't just assaulting women, she revealed, but using his position to steal land from Mexican families, forging documents with Sheriff Hawkins' help, and driving people from their homes when they couldn't fight back legally. "My cousin, Rosa," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "She lose her farm this way. Her husband, he tried to fight, and they find him dead by the river." Judge Morrison listened with growing outrage, making careful notes in his own book. The trial that followed 2 weeks later became the most talked about event in the territory's history. Judge Morrison had sent word ahead, and when they rode into Redemption Creek, they found federal marshals waiting and a town buzzing with rumors and speculation. Maria's testimony, backed by her meticulous documentation and corroborated by other victims who finally felt safe to speak, painted a picture of systematic abuse that shocked even the hardest frontier community. Henderson tried to discredit her as a vengeful prostitute, but when Emma Collins, the bank president's daughter, took the stand to describe her own assault, the rancher's defense crumbled like sand. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Jake sat in the courtroom throughout the trial, officially under arrest himself but treated more like a witness than a defendant. When it came time for his own sentencing, Judge Morrison's words carried a weight that transcended mere legal proceedings. "Jacob Morrison," his uncle said, "you've spent 15 years running from the law and from yourself. But in protecting this young woman, you've shown the kind of courage and moral clarity that I once hoped to see in you." The judge paused, looking directly into Jake's eyes. "The court sentences you to 5 years of community service, to be served helping to rebuild the farms and properties stolen through Henderson's schemes. You'll work under the supervision of Marshal Thompson, and if you complete your service faithfully, your record will be cleared." It was mercy wrapped in justice, and Jake felt something he'd forgotten existed, hope for a future he could actually live with. The transformation of Redemption Creek began immediately, as if Maria's courage had given the entire town permission to start over. The Mexican families who'd been driven from their land returned to find their property restored and their legal claims recognized. Maria herself was offered a position as translator and advocate for the territorial court, helping other immigrants navigate the complex legal system that had once been used against them. She accepted the job with characteristic dignity, but not before asking Jake a question that would change both their lives. "When you finish your service," she said, standing in the courthouse square as the sun set behind the mountains, "would you like to help me start a school? For the children who speak Spanish and English both?" The hope in her eyes was infectious, and Jake found himself nodding before he'd even fully processed the question. 5 years later, Jake Morrison stood in front of the one-room schoolhouse he and Maria had built together, watching her teach a group of children whose faces reflected the changing face of the American West. His shoulder had healed completely, leaving only a small scar as a reminder of the day his life had changed direction. The wanted posters with his name had long since been taken down, replaced by a reputation as a man who kept his word and helped his neighbors. He wore a simple gold band on his left hand now, a match to the one Maria wore on hers, and when she smiled at him across the classroom, he still felt that same jolt of wonder he'd experienced in the abandoned barn all those years ago. The town of Redemption Creek had lived up to its name in ways no one could have predicted. Where once corruption had flourished in shadows, now transparency and justice prevailed. The school taught children in both English and Spanish, preparing them for a future where diversity would be strength rather than suspicion. Jake often thought about the chain of events that had brought him to this point, how one moment of choosing to protect rather than destroy had led to a life he'd never dared imagine. As he watched Maria help a young boy sound out words in his native language, then translate them to English, Jake Morrison understood that redemption wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about transformation, about becoming the person you were always meant to be. On quiet evenings, when the schoolhouse was empty and the mountain air carried the scent of pine and possibility, Jake and Maria would sit on the porch they'd built together and talk about the future. They spoke of the children they hoped to have, of the community they were helping to build, of the dreams that seemed possible now in ways they never had before. "Do you ever regret it?" Maria would sometimes ask, meaning the old life he'd given up, the freedom of the open trail, the simplicity of living only for himself. Jake would take her hand and feel the calluses from years of honest work, would look into eyes that still held all the courage and compassion that had saved them both. "Never," he would answer, and mean it completely. "The only thing I regret is that it took me so long to find you." And in the fading light of another peaceful day in Redemption Creek, they would sit together and watch the stars come out over the mountains. Two people who had found in each other not just love, but the possibility of becoming more than they had ever been alone.